The Flames. History's greatest secret and key to a future where ships travel lifetimes to bring flames to new worlds. Those who dare to walk the fire can cross between the stars with a step if you can find a ferryman and pay your way across. For most who brave the flame alone are lost forever. May the ferryman take you. Crucible and Flame. 6. The ferryman staggered side to side as he followed tender cable through hedge-road paths. The ground shook beneath him, rolling waves of vibration that went on and on and on. The gravity lapped unevenly at his body like water sloshing against a shore. His inner ear spun like he was drunk, and he shivered with terror. Waves of destruction powerful enough to shake through the spine of the ship from somewhere amid the coiled kilometers of corridors and rooms. It seemed endless. Explosion after explosion shattering Ship 227 from within. "Where is our shelter?" he gasped when he caught up to the tender at the third door he stopped at. "Miss Kendrick!" Cable yelled, staggering inside. The ground shifted beneath them again. The ferryman slammed into the doorframe. He shook his head to clear away the stars. "Cable, we have to get to shelter!" Cable nodded. "Miss Kendrick was my last stop," he wheezed. "Can't walk without 2 canes, so someone else must have beat me to her." He smiled, and it was clear he was proud of whoever had come to save her before him. The ferryman growled and grabbed the tender's collar, yanking him into motion. At the pathway's next intersection, Cable took the lead and ran away from the glow-painted arrow flashing on the ground. The ferryman knew that meant they were taking the long way to safety, but he followed. He was scared, so scared. How long had it been since he felt truly mortally scared? Had Cable been alive? Had this generation ship, hundreds of years old, even been launched? He'd been stabbed, fallen, stories, developed always fatal diseases, found himself smack dab in the middle of earthquakes, but he always knew he'd be fine. He'd lost limbs, had organs fail, had even intentionally flirted with harm to stave off decades of boredom at a time, but when had anything left him so heart-stoppingly afraid? So why was he following the idiot tender instead of getting his ass into one of the emergency shelters until the powers that be that ran the ship, or Gollivant's asshole representative, came to save him? "Get those men's suits!" The ferryman could tell it was Lieutenant Cho who grunted the words out of a spacesuit speaker system. He and 2 more unknown spacesuited men heaved against a long metal bar worked into the manual release wheel of a small airlock door. He gasped. On the wall just above the door, a story's tall dent had appeared. His eyes roved up the wall. In other places it looked like it had bubbled under extreme heat. The flame was on the other side of that wall. He was trapped. He shook his head, breathed deep, to fend off his exponentially swelling fear. He looked back at the small door where the men worked. It was a maintenance airlock adjacent to the main access to the commons. Scorch marks around the main airlock doors and the sparking mess of wires ripped from the console between it and the small airlock door told the tale. The commons was cut off from the ship. The ferryman and tender Cable were pushed back past the giant metal trees spaced in front of the doors by 2 men in black and orange spacesuits. One of the men ran to an emergency supply crate that had been haphazardly dropped at the base of the trees and withdrew 2 orange-wrapped kits with bulky belts, emergency suits. Trembling, the ferryman leaned against the railing on the bridge to step out of the work clothes the tender had loaned him for the duration of his stay. He regretted it, surprised by the comfort they had lent him in just a few days, as he'd worked beside the tender in the church, tending his beehives and tending his flock. He almost laughed, thinking of the long way he'd come from his demands for fine clothes on his first day here after walking the fire to Ship 227. Then he looked over the railing into the water below the bridge and saw the still white bellies of dead fish bobbing on the surface of the water, bubbling, steaming water, And he stripped down even faster. "Let me," Cable's voice said kindly out of a chest-mounted suit speaker a few minutes later, when the ferryman still hadn't managed to seal his helmet. The tender showed him the trick, had him unclasp and reseal the helmet a few more times, the removable gloves too. Once the lesson was over and his student was taking shaky breaths of suit air, Cable asked, "How many ferrymen does it take to screw in a helmet?" Both men were still doubled over, laughing and crying in equal cathartic parts when Cho bounded over to them. "Tender, ferryman, I need you to sit your asses in a shelter now." Lieutenant Cho's formerly gentle, humorous words had become commanding bolts of electricity, singing up and down his spine and setting the ferryman's legs in motion. He was already turning to follow the glowing arrows on the ground when Cable stood up straight and set a hand on Cho's shoulder. "There's not enough able-bodied men in the Commons right now to man the emergency stations. You're what, 5 men here trying to get these doors open?" His calm voice reached the lieutenant, whose shoulders inched away from his neck inside his spacesuit. "Let us free up a couple of your men to do tasks we don't have training for." "TC," Cho whispered, "if you get yourself killed." That's when the ferryman heard the terror hidden beneath Cho's command voice. "We won't," Cable promised. He clapped his hand back down harder on Lieutenant Cho's shoulder, then walked around him and headed for the smaller door. "Ship's insulated in so many different ways, it's a problem right now," Cho explained, falling in step behind Cable. "Comm systems are down, so we don't know what we're facing. Besides from not knowing what's going on, and shitting myself, it means I don't know what needs doing, how to prepare, what resources to divert to the shelters. Too hot, too cold, nowhere, what?" The ferryman heard Cho's confusion and his helpless anger, and Cable tapped the 2 men still straining against the bar in the metal pinwheel securing the airlock door. They peeled off, each heading in a different direction with a purpose. Obviously, they did have better things to do, he mused. Must have been why Phil Cho was willing to let his hero risk his ass out here. "And me," the ferryman qualified his own silent thought with a gulp. There was that thrill of fear up and down his spine again. Tender Cable counted down from 3, and all 3 men threw themselves against the bar. The wheel turned, just a few millimeters, screaming all the way, right through the suit to set the marrow in their bones quivering. "If comms are down, that means distributed emergency," they heard Cho grunt from right behind them, his voice harsh through harshly gritted teeth and their helmets' speaker grills. "Everything on 227's got 2 or 3 or 10 backup systems." They pushed again. The wheel screamed another few millimeters around. "Not a physical impact," Cho went on, talking out loud to keep his panic in check now that Cable had pierced his command persona. They counted again. Pushed again. The wheel turned again. Got shields for that. Whatever went boom. Gotta be internal." 3 men pushed. Warped metal screamed. The wheel turned again, and kept turning. Surprised, the men collapsed in a heap, quickly untangling their limbs and clearing the door. Cho picked up Cable and physically tossed him clear of the door, barking at one of his men to get him tied to something. "Him too," the lieutenant barked, pointing now at the ferryman. Knowing his orders would be obeyed, he turned to the door and pulled. It wouldn't open. He tapped on the panel. "It's not jammed in the frame anymore," he muttered over the open channel all their suits shared. Then another of his men's voices crowed on the channel. "Oh, no! Oh, no, no, no!" "Hernandez, pack that shit up!" Cho bellowed, jogging over to where the man had abandoned his work repairing the airlock's comms console and slumped down the side of the wall to the ground. Another of the men swore on the channel. Another cried. The ferryman and Cable raced over to where Cho stood frozen, staring at the console. The image on the screen was still black, so why was Cho just staring? The ferryman looked at the panel. It wasn't all black. There were little pinpricks of white. When the realization hit him, he fell to the ground too. "Well, shit," Cable breathed, the only man not driven to his knees. The camera was live. The camera was working. It was showing black and tiny dots of white. Everyone had just assumed the visual was glitching because the camera was just on the other side of the airlock door. It either showed a cramped square room or the opposite airlock doors opening onto the long corridor beyond. The camera was live. The camera was working. It wasn't showing the corridor beyond, because there no longer was a corridor beyond. The camera was faithfully displaying what was beyond the airlock door. The camera was showing stars. Walk the Fire by John Miro. Learn more at servingworlds.com. Theme music, Full On by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com. Many of the stories you listen to here on Serving Worlds were made possible by the support of patrons at patreon.com/servingworlds. If you got $1 of entertainment from this story, please consider backing me for $1 at patreon.com/servingworlds. Thank you for listening.